Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here. Excited to break down Roki Sasaki. He has been absolutely lighting up the radar gun, lighting up social media. So I wanted to take a little bit of a closer look at his mechanics, at how he does it, and just kind of give you guys kind of my thoughts on what makes him so special, so unique, and would he be able to pitch? Would he have success in the MLB as well? So first thing is looking at some of his metrics, at least the reported metrics from the NPB. So his fastball has a 19.8 inch vertical break and a 15.4 inch average horizontal break, averaging 99.5 miles an hour. Now those are some pretty astronomical metrics for a fastball. Once you start getting north of like 18 inches of vert, that starts to be a very high carry average fastball. To put this in perspective, Garrett Cole, who has one of the best fastballs in the big leagues as a starter, averaged 17.9 inches of vertical break, 11.9 inches of horizontal break at 97.7 miles per hour last year. So Roki is getting a couple more inches of vert, a couple more inches of horizontal movement as well, and throwing a couple miles an hour harder than Garrett Cole. There's one caveat here, which is that the NPB uses slightly tackier balls than MLB does. So it's entirely possible a couple inches of that movement could be from that. Again, it's hard to say exactly, but either way you slice it, that is an absolutely electric, elite fastball by the metrics, not only from the movement standpoint, but also from the pure velocity standpoint. As far as his splitter, might be his best pitch. He's averaging 91.2 miles an hour with that pitch at 2.3 inches of 3 inches of induced vertical break and 7.8 inches of induced horizontal movement. To put that in perspective, that would be one of the hardest and best splitters in the MLB, if not far and away the best splitter at this point in MLB. Shohei Ohtani's splitter is averaging 2.4 inches of vert and 4.9 inches of horizontal. So Sasaki is actually getting a few more inches of arm side run on his splitter and throwing it about 3 miles an hour harder than Ohtani's splitter. So it is actually a better pitch than Ohtani's splitter, purely based on the metrics. For me, this almost reminds me of a Roger Clemens type splitter. He also threw his in the low 90s. We don't have any metrics on Roger Clemens' splitter, but I definitely would encourage you guys to check out the video where we do break down his splitter in a little bit more detail. But that is kind of a Hall of Fame splitter. And seeing Sasaki's metrics here, just looking at how it compares visually to Roger Clemens' splitter, there are some similarities there with the arm side run. Long story short here, he really does have two absolutely unicorn level pitches for a starter, which is again exceptionally rare. No question, he would be one of the top MLB starters from a metric standpoint. So those pitches in isolation, right, both would certainly play at the big league level. But again, we'll kind of leave that conversation whether or not he's coming over here for another day. But certainly has the potential, pretty electric arm, pretty electric talent, and the splitter is really a next level pitch, especially when paired with a high vert fastball. If we go into a little bit more about his body type, he's a guy who, for me, almost reminds me of like an Edwin Diaz or a Tristan McKenzie type body type. He's very thin, very wiry. He's not exceptionally tall, so he's 6'3", 187 pounds. He's a guy who, watching him throw, I would describe him as more of a kind of fascia-driven type athlete, right? He doesn't get into any sort of insane positions, right? Looking at his mechanics here, like he's not, in his upper half at least, he's not getting into like Ben Joyce type positions as far as the, his arm action, as far as his scap retraction, as far as his separation. You look at his lower half, his back leg, he's not getting into like a Daniel Espino position with his back leg, or a Dylan Cease level of separation. We'll break that down more in a second, but reminds me much more of a guy like McKenzie, Ohtani, Edwin Diaz, where it's way more about how efficiently he's able to transfer that energy up through his body using the elastic properties of his body. So we look at the different ways that power can be produced. You can kind of look at it one of two ways, right? There's the more muscle-driven type of power, right? This is something I discussed with a javelin coach, Kevin Foster, on a recent Tread podcast. So I will link that below, where he really described it as like, hey, if you're going to go do a power movement in the weight room, that's much more muscle driven. Let's say you do a speed bench press, right? It's much more how powerfully can I contract my pec pec muscle fibers to move this bar as fast as possible. Fascia driven, on the other hand, when it comes to throwing, it's much more about how properly you can sequence all the different joint segments in the body to allow the elastic properties in your body to function. So you're storing and releasing elastic energy using the tendons and the fascia of your body and getting into proper positions to maximize that rubber band-like effect that you have naturally throughout your body and throughout the fascia. So just different ways of producing that type of power. Sasaki, again, strikes me from the way that he throws and from his just kind of slender build as much more of this fascial driven type athlete as far as how he produces his power. So he's really utilizing the positions and sequencing to stretch that rubber band instead of, brute strength or extreme ranges of motion, right? Ben Joyce would kind of be the opposite. He's much more getting into crazy deep positions, so range of motion, and utilizing this high level of muscular strength to produce that velocity. So just a different way that he's kind of producing it. Again, it's pretty obvious he's extremely explosive, extremely fast twitch. I think Tristan McKenzie might be a great example here. Neither one gets in really extreme positions. Both of them are extremely skinny. Both of them are extremely explosive. And so again, just looking at generally big picture before we kind of zoom in what type of athlete he is, just understanding very, very explosive athlete. Probably not the strongest athlete if you went and tested his 1 rep max and a bunch of lifts though. Let's get to kind of what everybody is wanting to hear about, which are his mechanics. So what does he do well? What does he do differently in his mechanics? Well, let's take a look at his first move. So the kind of first thing that strikes me as we work through that first move, first off, he looks down, right? This is something that I've talked about a lot. Quite a few pitching coaches are anti looking away from the target. They think that if at any point you look down, you look away from the target, there's inevitably going to be a decrease in your ability to command the baseball. And we just simply don't see that in most guys, right? There's so many Hall of Fame caliber pitchers and all-star level pitchers and pitchers in the big leagues right now, or in Sasaki's case, the MPB, where they do look down, and that kind of allows them to be more athletic, right? My kind of theory on this, be more athletic, shift away from this like super hyper focus, fine focus on the target, and turn it into more of an automatic type movement where you get out of the conscious thinking part of your brain into more of the subconscious. So we have seen positive results with a lot of our guys where, from a command standpoint, it's like, hey, let's take the gaze down, let's take the gaze off the target during that initial move, during the leg lift, so that when you do finally pick up the target a little bit later, it's more of an automatic kind of reaction to finishing the throw versus hyper focusing on the target the whole time. It both can work, but understanding which type of pitcher you are and which works better for you can be extremely helpful. For me, that was a game changer, to not be staring at the mitt from getting the sign to coming set through the entire delivery all the way to ball release. I just couldn't hold focus for that long. We look at tempo. Tempo is the other big thing that you kind of notice here. He takes his time. He lets his leg lift kind of gather his weight over his back leg to some extent. He's not rushing his way down the mound. It's not like he's coming to this super slow, deliberate like balance point. But again, this reminds me more of a Shohei Ohtani as far as the first move, where he's letting himself have a little bit of a gather during this portion right here. He's not trying to necessarily speed his way down the mound as fast as humanly possible at the very start of the throw. This is a gather, it's a build up, and kind of that's the other thing I notice here. He's not rushing his way down the mound. You'll see he also kind of rises up onto the back leg. So as he lifts, he starts with a little bit of kind of knee flexion. So you can see he comes set a little bit of a hinge. As he lifts his leg right here, his back leg extends. So you can see his kind of where his head starts to the top of his leg lift. He actually rises up a little bit. He extends a little bit. This is somewhat similar to how Yusei Kikuchi kind of uses that first move to rise up a little bit, kind of unweight himself on the back leg, get a little bit of a gather, and then from there, drop down, use that as a kind of a cue for dropping down into the hinge, dropping down into the back leg. So again, you can see how right here, he's rising up, unweighting the back leg slightly, allowing the throw to gather, and then as he drops into the back leg, that's when he finds the hinge again. So that initial forward move, again, going back to the side view, this initial forward move, he's not in the hinge right here. He's actually coming up, he's unweighting the back leg, he's gathering himself, boom, drops down. Now he's caught the hinge, and now he's caught that weight, he's accepted weight, accepted load in this backside. So I think that's an important distinction to make. And the final thing about his first move, going back to the front view, he's a guy who has a good amount of coil, a good amount of counter rotation. So you look at how far turned this knee is. His knee is facing, honestly, beyond where the shortstop would be playing. So he's very coiled, very counter rotated. This is something that you typically see pitchers with really good hip internal rotation do. And we'll talk more about his internal rotation in a second. But he is a pitcher with a lot of internal rotation in his hips, and the coil is actually a way to kind of remove what's called muscle slack in the system. So from a side view, right, he has a lot of range of motion in this back hip. If we add a coil right there, so we add a coil, you're able to take some of that slack out and get into a more stable kind of end position on the back hip, so we have something stable to actually drop into and drive out of, if that makes sense. So the coil, this counter rotation is pretty common in pitchers that have very mobile hips in terms of hip internal rotation. Pitchers with less hip internal rotation but really good hip external rotation, someone like a Justin Verlander, might not and typically don't prefer this type of position because their hips don't have the range of motion to coil so much over that back leg. So again, just unique to how his body functions. It's not surprising that he's kind of adopted some of these positions to maximally utilize the structure of the levers that he has and the range of motion that he has. So we go from here into the linear move. The big thing that we like to talk about is the drop into the hinge. So that forward move, it's a gather, he's unweighted the backside, he's dancing through it, boom, he drops into the hinge right here. So I just want to kind of mention two things. One is, again, the amount of coil that he has there, but two is that position of the lead leg right here. So this is a lot of hip internal rotation. Right, if you were to lay on the ground and let your knees fall in towards each other, that's testing your hip internal rotation. This is an extreme amount. I mean, he's probably pushing 55, 60 degrees of hip IR, which is in kind of the top, I would say 1% of athletes that we see in terms of how much hip internal rotation range of motion they've got. Backside, it's a little bit harder to tell because his pelvis is not neutral. If his pelvis was neutral, then max IR would be the knees kind of facing each other, the knees coming together. But because his pelvis is coiled so much towards second base, this back leg actually is in internal rotation as well. It's just hard to kind of pinpoint and see from that particular angle, from that position. Another thing that he does really, really well, if we go back to the front view, is we look at his ability to stay closed until the last second. So let's look at that counter rotation he's got. Look at his pelvis. You can kind of look at this this left pocket facing the catcher the whole time. So as he comes out, he drops into his linear move, boom, right there. He's in the back leg now. He's loaded up this right glute while holding that coil, holding that counter rotation. Watch as he moves to the target, what that pocket does. So he's keeping the pelvis closed this entire time. Even as he drops, even as he moves down the slope, he's holding that counter rotation right there. So this pelvis is staying very level, very stable, and he's holding it closed. Closed, 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 boom, right there. Just before landing is when he fires, and that's when he starts to actually corkscrew the hips open. And then from there, everything goes. So his ability to drop into the backside, boom, ride it forward without leaking open early is one of the things that kind of separates him as far as mechanical efficiency. He's able to hold the pelvis close, he's able to drop into the pelvis, hold it closed, ride it forward, and then at the last second, pop it open and create that tornado-like spiral of energy through the hips and that's what uncoils and uncorks all the rest of that energy up through his torso, up through his arm, and ultimately out into the ball. I think it's, again, worth mentioning, like, this is a pretty uncommon type of lower half loading mechanism, at least in the US. It's a little more common in Japan, a little more common in Korea. But I think Edwin Diaz, to me, is kind of the first name I think of when I see this front leg, when I see this position, as a guy who's able to hold close so well, but still kind of reach into landing with that lead leg in crazy hip internal rotation. So again, Edwin Diaz, similar body type. He's 6'3", listed at like 165, so even skinnier than Sasaki, and he averaged 98.8 miles an hour last year. So again, within about a mile an hour of Sasaki as a reliever, lower arm slot, like differences as well, but he's the first guy I think of when I think of that very late snapping open of the hips and being able to delay pelvic rotation so late. If we look at the unload from here, one of the things we talk about a lot is being able to rotate in a very tight window. And so from the front view, you can kind of see as he begins to uncork, right? He's rotating. If you had like an L screen on this side of him and an L screen on this side of him, that's kind of what we're talking about with rotating in a tight window. It's a very late, crisp popping open of the hips at the very last second, fully closed to snapping open into landing at the very last second. That's what rotating in a tight window means. And then allowing that to unload the rest of the chain. So he's not a particularly high range of motion guy, which we touched on before. From this angle, you can really see that, you can really tell exactly what we're talking about. So you go to this position right here, you see the angle of the arm in full scap retraction, right? He's not getting into a bend joist type position. This is way more like a Shohei Ohtani position. So he doesn't have crazy deep scap retraction, again, because he's more kind of fascial driven, and that's how he's creating the velocity from this snapping open of the lower half, and from being an extremely explosive athlete, extremely elastic athlete. Another thing to point out here, as we kind of play this back, is a common flaw you'll see with lower level throwers is that into landing, they start to arch the back. So they start to extend their thoracic spine as they go into landing, right? He doesn't try to extend into landing. He actually lets the hips unload the spine, unload the arm. So watch how the hips are the first thing. The hips unload, and that corkscrews everything else up the chain. As soon as the hips go, now the T-spine goes. It's, again, really common into landing. Guys will start in this kind of early extension or yanking the front side open. So he really is patient with his intensity, patient with the kind of violence to his throw, and he allows the hips to be kind of the driver of that. As the hips pop open, that corkscrews everything else open, kind of like a gearbox, one at a time, segmentally up the spine. If we look at his arm action, one thing that he does, which no doubt contributes to his ability to create that really high axis, high efficiency, high vertical break fastball, is kind of stay on top of the ball for a very long time. So from this position right here, you could argue that his arm is a hair late in that position. It's not completely up, but you'll see as he begins to rotate, he doesn't actually have a ton of layback in this position. So he's not a hyperlax guy, again, which we talked about, but he creates just enough. So he's still creating about 180 degrees relative to where his trunk is. So he's still creating about 180 degrees of layback, but he does a really good job, if the goal is to create this high vertical fastball, of staying on top of the ball with his hand, with his arm the entire time. So we go back to the front view. Again, you can see he's staying very much on top of the ball at this point, creating that very tight spin, very high efficiency, very high vertical break type approach. Again, to throw a really good splitter, typically helpful to get from a little bit of a higher slot, a little bit of a higher axis as well. So it makes sense how he's kind of adjusted or adapted from a fastball splitter combo to be a little bit of this kind of high 3/4 slot. Another thing I would like to kind of touch on real quick as well is the timing of that intensity. So I alluded to that before with kind of the rhythm, the initial gather during his first move, during his forward move. But again, he's dancing through the forward move, low effort, low effort, low effort, drops into the back hip, pops it open. He's still loose, relaxed. And then this is something that Ben Joyce talked about in the podcast that I did with him last week, if you guys haven't checked that out already. But he talked about late hand speed. He talked about, hey, I'm very low effort. I'm just trying to be smooth, fluid, relaxed. Jacob deGrom has mentioned this as well in interviews. Smooth, fluid, relaxed, sequenced. And they talked about late hand speed. So as he begins to rotate just after landing, that's when the intensity gets applied. And so that's what he does such a great job of, is transitioning from this relaxed position, popping everything open, and boom, right there is when he turns it on. That's when he turns on that electricity and releases all of that stored elastic energy. And again, ridiculously explosive fast twitch athlete as well. So the timing of this intensity, the timing of that rotational violence, he delays it extremely well at the same time. So again, I've thrown a lot at you. There's a lot to kind of pick apart and nitpick with his mechanics as far as what he does differently, what he does well. One of the questions that I asked myself when I was kind of looking into some of his numbers, looking into some video for this breakdown, is, well, could he throw even harder? So he's sitting like 99 to 101, touching 102, touching 103. Could he throw harder? My answer to that is it's really hard to say, simply because once a guy starts throwing that hard, it becomes really difficult to project out from there. If he was throwing 96, 20, 25 pounds under what he could be weighing, knowing that he could be getting significantly stronger, you might be able to project a few miles an hour. The issue is you take a guy like Aroldis Chapman, right? Once he got to touching 105 miles an hour at 205 pounds, right? It's like, where do you project a guy from that, right? If he gained 20 pounds, like, does he throw 108? It doesn't really work that way once they start getting to some of these more elite levels. It's certainly possible he could be a guy that touches 105. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it becomes very difficult to project velocity increases once a guy is already in the 99.9th percentile and moving relatively, or very efficiently rather, for their frame. I think what's most likely, and what I would still recommend to him, is, hey, it's still likely a benefit to increase those strength levels, increase that body weight just a little bit. Definitely not gain any body fat, but at 185, 187 pounds at 6'3", that is very slender. Getting up to 195, 200 pounds, probably not a terrible idea. With Aroldis Chapman, he did kind of take it to that next level. But I think there's a valid argument to be made from a durability standpoint and being able to sustain that velocity for the next 10, 15 years, or at least close to it. There's a good argument to be made for the durability side that comes with strength. Now, I don't think he's going to get a huge velocity bump if he got 25% stronger, because again, that's not necessarily how he produces his velocity. But just from a tendon strengthening standpoint, from a durability standpoint, from an ability to recover standpoint, from a wear and tear standpoint, I think that would potentially be an area that could be improved moving forward. Just again, based on what we've seen from hundreds and hundreds of athletes, taking them from that kind of skinnier range to just adding a little bit more size to them and bumping those strength numbers up just a bit. So again, I'd be extremely excited to see him pitch in the MLB, hopefully one day. His stuff is electric. He does a lot really, really well. And again, it's definitely a unique combination that we don't see as much over here in the US with the fastball splitter combination. Hopefully you guys learned something from that video. Hopefully you took something away from it. If you have any questions about the breakdown, go ahead, drop a comment down below, and I will let you know. Go ahead and subscribe to this channel if you're not already. Give this video a thumbs up. And if you want to hear more baseball related content, you can follow us on Twitter at TreadAthletics, Instagram at Tread_athletics. We also have a TikTok. We have an email, contact@treadathletics.com, for any questions you have regarding your own pitching career. Thanks again, guys, and I will see you in the next video. Take care.